So yesterday we had the 26th annual memorial service for Maizumi Roshi, my teacher. And Great Mountain Zen Center in Maitreya Abbey hosted the event, and a couple of you were there. And we did the service in our Zendo, and Roshi Shinko and I gave Dharma words, which were kind of a little different. I may get to that at the end of the talk. We heard from Roshi Agioku, who was the third abbot of Zen Center of Los Angeles, which is the mother temple of our lineage. And she's now the abbot emeritus. And we had a slideshow and some other remembrances. But there were about 140 people who tuned in from around the world. So in the White Plum lineage, which is a lineage that started from Maizumi Roshi, there's about 120 teachers. And it started with 12 successors, of which I'm one. And I just want to give a little perspective of the Zen Center of LA and Maizumi Roshi. And when I first came to the Zen Center of LA, it was 1972. So if you do the math, that's 49 years ago. And I was working at the University of California in San Diego, which is about a 2-hour drive up the freeway. And they just had 3-day sessions starting Thursday night and ending on Sunday afternoon. And one of my good friends, Charlotte Choco Beck, also worked at the same university where I did. And we would commute up the freeway. We would be ready to go. I'd grab her right after work, and we'd drive up, and we would arrive at the Zen Center right when the Han was sounding, signaling the beginning of session, and we would jump out of the car and run into the Zendo without any time to decompress. But in 1972, the Zen Center had just bought the second building on the block. They had one building which used to be a dentist's office and his home. And I'm looking at the faces here. I know Kendo was there. Probably remembers it well. And the Doksan room was one of the rooms where people had their teeth extracted and fillings put in. But Maizumi Roshi extracted other things in the Doksan room. And most of the sessions at that time were very small, like about the size of the one we have right here, maybe 15 people, but or less sometimes. But that changed rapidly. By the end of the decade, the Zen Center had bought more properties, and eventually in that square block, it owned 4 apartment buildings and 6 houses. And all of the growth was engineered by the head monk there, Bernie Tetsugen Glassman, with the encouragement of Maizumi Roshi. And Bernie was a very serious fellow. He ran a tight Zendo, while Maizumi Roshi was a warm heart in the Doksan room, mostly, but not always. Sometimes he was very stern. But I'll never forget the first Ahango, which is the 90-day training period we had at the Zen Center of LA. That was in 74. And Bernie was the Shuso, which is a head trainee, head monk. And at his ceremony, the Shuso Hosen, he talked about the koan kazans beat the drum. Some of you might know that. And he took dharma challenges from the assembled sangha, and Bernie was very masterful in responding to the questions. And during the ceremony, I looked over at Maizumi Roshi, and he was silently weeping tears of joy. And recently, Bernie, of course, Bernie died a couple years ago, and his widow, Eve Marco, came across a letter that she shared that Maizumi Roshi sent to Bernie in the late 1960s. Bernie started practicing with Maizumi Roshi in the 1960s. And this is a letter. It says, "Please do not forget," and that was bolded, "that my major concern is to have the handful, even less, truly awakened Dharma successors in the United States before I leave this world." His concern, was allayed by Bernie. And the only other time I saw Maizumi Roshi weep in the Zendo was when he was talking to us after his mother had died. And it was in the 1980s. And Maizumi Roshi's mother and father had 7 sons. And 6 of them became Soto Zen priests. And the 7th was a sculptor of sacred Buddhist images. And the family name is Kuroda, but all of his brothers, their names are Kuroda, but Maizumi Roshi, he took the name Maizumi because that was his mother's maiden name. And there were no men in her side of the family, so he took the name Maizumi to honor his mother. And he adored his mother. And I met her in Japan, and of course they came to the Zen Center, but his mother was very diminutive and just had tremendous amount of energy taking care of her husband and all of these strapping young men that she had mothered. We had a huge memorial service for Maizumi Roshi in Los Angeles on the first anniversary of his death. And I'm going to read a couple paragraphs of what Bernie wrote at the time. He said, "I first met Maizumi Roshi in 1963. At that time, he was a young Soto monk working in Los Angeles as in Shuji, which was the temple of the Soto Zen mission in North America. I attended a small Zazen Kai at Zen Shuji. Although I had some familiarity with Zazen, walking meditation was new to me, so I asked Sumi Roshi, who was running it, "What are we doing during walking meditation?" And Sumi Roshi turned to Maizumi Sensei and indicated he should answer. And he said, "When we walk, we just walk." Even today, I'm struck by the simplicity and directness of this teaching. It has guided me throughout all these years. And 7 years later, in 1970, I was the first person to receive Tokudo. Tokudo means to ordain as a priest or a monk, from Maizumi Sensei. And then Maizumi Sensei became a Roshi later. So at this 1-year memorial, I paused to reflect on my 35 years with him. There are several themes that stand out. First, Maizumi Roshi always stressed the importance of clarity of one's understanding. If I may use the analogy of an egg, Maizumi Roshi realized the importance of transmitting the egg yolk, the essence of the Buddha Dharma, and with unwavering commitment and devotion. He guided his students in realizing this essence and transmitting the true teachings. Maizumi Roshi empowered his students to also take care of the egg white, the cultural context of the practice, and encourage his students to develop the appropriate Western forms of practice. Secondly, Maizumi Roshi taught me the importance of lineage. In particular, he emphasized the lineage that represents people who continue in practice until they themselves receive dharma transmission and in turn pass it on. He taught me how rare this transmission is, especially when one considers the many reasons why so many people may stop practicing at some point, such as reasons of doubt, family, work, illness, and so forth. In actual practice, the odds of someone finishing their formal study is very small. He taught me to really appreciate lineage from that standpoint. In our study together, Maizumi Roshi focused on his own direct lineage, but he also stressed the importance of seeing the many streams that support and make one's lineage work. Of course, it's easier to see the direct cause of things rather than the indirect causes. And yet there's so many indirect streams that are equally important in shaping things. In this light, Maizumi Roshi often talked of how important it was to understand the entire Soto lineage, not just one's own, and to fully appreciate how we're supported by it. So I want to talk a little bit about all of the causes that affect our lives. I mean, we don't even know what they are. There are so many indirect ones, and we don't see them. And I'm going to give a silly example that I often use when I teach classes in Buddhism. So those of us who live in Colorado or other places that have real winters, we see the leaves falling off the trees, and then it gets cold. And if you were looking at cause and effect, you could say, well, the leaves falling off the trees caused it to be cold. Of course, we know in our infinite wisdom that the earth circulates around the sun and that the axis is tilted and we have the seasons and so forth. But I said, well, if you don't want it to get cold, you should recruit all your friends and go around and glue the leaves back on the trees, and then it won't get cold. And it seems silly, and it is, but if we look at what we think are the causes of things in our life, it's not so silly, because we don't always know what the causes are, but yet we put so much stock in them, So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to deal with all of these indirect causes we know nothing about. But we're constantly looking for somebody to blame for any difficulties or any problems that we have in life. So in the late 1970s and early 80s, the Zen Center thrived, and there were dozens of serious practitioners like me who were willing to work on the staff in exchange for room and board and $50 a month for living expenses. And of course, we got all the Zazen and Zen training that we wanted. And there were a number of skilled craftspeople who developed businesses and donated all the profits to the center. We had, I recall, Zen landscaping, Zen plumbing, Zen carpentry, Zen electrical, Zen painting. There was a center medical clinic. We had a number of doctors on the staff. And there was center publications, which put out a number of books on on Buddhism. And we created the Kuroda Institute for the study of Buddhism, and we sponsored academic conferences, and we published scholarly books on Buddhism. Everything was going swimmingly. By the mid-80s, Maizumi Roshi had empowered 4 successors: Bernie, Genpo Merzel, Joko Beck, and Chosen Bays, and his major concern was not so major anymore. But major concerns arose in the Sangha as Maizumi Roshi's drinking habits became more of a problem. And when it became public that he had some secret liaisons with a few of his female students, the fabric of the Zen Center started to unravel. The Zen Center did not have guidelines in place for dealing with boundary violations and unethical behavior. Maizumi Roshi's major concern of having awakened successors was emphasized, but at that time, awaken meant to have a clear eye into the mysteries of the Dharma, but had nothing to do with one's insight into one's character flaws and bad habits. The problem was endemic in Buddhist communities across the country, and it's still a problem that needs to be addressed in some areas. And the retiring abbot, Roshi Egyoku Nikao, has been addressing it at Zen Center of LA for years, and she talked about that yesterday. It was a marvelous talk. So more than half of the Sangha members dropped out in disillusionment, and the Zen Center was hemorrhaging. And I remained behind. I was asked by many people, why did you stay? And I said that if my father were an alcoholic, I wouldn't abandon him. And of course, Maizumi Roshi was my spiritual father. And I had an excuse too that said if I wanted to learn the violin, I just want to find the best master I could. I didn't worry what they did in their private life. But that at the time, I retract that statement. Actually, I think it is important. And those of us who remained in supporting Maizumi Roshi, we encouraged him to enroll in an addiction program. And we restructured the center's finances. We brought in community counselors and therapists to heal the deep wounds that opened up in the community. We had to sell half of the buildings on the block and pull back, and the grandiosity had vanished. And when he returned from his substance abuse clinic, Maizumi Roshi was very contrite and apologetic, and he realized the damage that he had done. He continued to teach, but he was more subdued than he was before. But he continued to keep his eye on his major concern, and eventually transmitted the Dharma to a total of 12 people. And I could put it in this way, that his only concern was helping humans to become Buddhas. He had no training in the other part of the formula, and that's helping Buddhas to become fully human. It fell to his successors to develop that part of Zen training. And it's interesting, in Roshi Egyoku's talk yesterday, she said that when she became the abbot, which I think was 22 years ago, she said, at Zen Center of LA, some of the people who left came back. And she said that their mindset hadn't evolved at all. They were still in the same place that they were when they had left, maybe 20 years before. And they had to do a lot of healing, to shed light on the shadow side of the community. But Maizumi Roshi embodied all the paradoxes of being an awakened person. He was charming, warm, and a stern taskmaster. He helped me to awaken to the subtleties of the Dharma. For those serious about pursuing the Zen path, he was always available to share his understanding of the Dharma. That's his legacy as the first abbot. Before he died, of course, I heard him say, "I cannot develop American Zen. That is up to my successors." He died in 1995 in rather sad circumstances. He was in Japan visiting his brother. And when he didn't drink in the United States, but when he went back to Japan, since his whole family drank, he would drink with them. And he was tired from his trip, and he fell asleep in a hot tub and drowned. And overnight, Bernie Glassman inherited Maizumi Roshi's Dharma realm and became the second abbot of ZCLA. And just before he died, Maizumi Roshi completed the paperwork for Bernie's Inca, which gave him the title of Roshi. Maizumi Roshi was 64 years old when he died. What a pity that he died so young, since he had so much more to offer. But I also had a strong feeling he was ready to get out of the way and let us proceed on our own. Like many of the Asian teachers who came to the West, Maizumi Roshi spent his life spreading the Dharma to Westerners. He was able to make a heart connection with his students. He was both gentle and fierce when he needed to be. And his students were offered the best of both Zen traditions, the intense koan study of Rinzai and the silent illumination of Soto. And the depth and influence of his training can be gauged by the diversity and influence of his successors. Actually, Mui, was in 2 White Plum centers before he came to this one, so he knows something about the diversity. And also Kendo was studied with Bernie Glassman as well as Maizumi Roshi. And some of you have studied, and Chris and Lisa studied with another White Plum teacher before coming here. My experience in the Doksan room with Maizumi Roshi, who was highly skilled in cutting off delusion and directing the student to deepen his or her realization and practice. He did have well-known character flaws, but his primary focus never wavered from sharing himself and his understanding of the Dharma with his students. He was always accessible. Although he has gone, his vows live on with his successors. After he died, his successors could have easily fractured into separate non-interacting units like some other Zen lineages did when their founder died. Even though we went through years of dysfunction, like a dysfunctional family, we still loved each other. And our main focus for the next 10 years was healing the wounds that afflicted the children of an alcoholic parent. When I first came to ZCLA, there was a plaque inscribed, actually it was carved on a block of wood by Maizumi Roshi and hung outside the Zendo. And it read in part, "Those who wish to realize and actualize the Buddha way are welcome. Otherwise, you better keep out. Let us be harmonious like milk dissolved in water. Temporarily, there are relationships of guest to master and juniors to seniors. However, eventually, all of us will be Buddhas forever. We should maintain the Buddha mind moment after moment." So when I became the president of the White Plum lineage in 2007, we tried to let go of the patriarchal hierarchy and get rid of distinctions of senior and junior in the organization, which was tricky because there were teachers and their students in there. But we did manage to flatten the hierarchy and create statements of ethical behavior for White Plum teachers. And we had a few teachers that could not maintain proper boundaries, and they either dropped out and are independent with no affiliation with their lineage, or they went through a process of reconciliation. And the president after me, Roshi Sason Saunders, she extended the boundary work and the grievance work. And as I said, actually, there's now more than 180 empowered teachers in the White Plum lineage, and it extends over many continents. There's quite a few in Europe. Yesterday in the Zoom meeting for the memorial, we had people that I knew tuned in from Holland, Ireland, Poland. We have centers in England, in France, in Germany. And also we have centers in South America, in New Zealand, and Australia. As I mentioned, the practice we had didn't deal very effectively with intimate relationships, raising children, bringing mindfulness to the workplace. But don't misunderstand, with the right approach to our practice, all of these issues can be addressed and dealt with. But since the practice was developed in a monastic environment, the issues of lay people were not handled directly, and there's more teaching along that line. You know, Roshi Shinko and I wrote The Great Heart Way, and that's primarily what it's about, how to use your Zazen practice to deal with personal, emotional, and psychological issues. But when Zen came to us, you know, it was developed in a monastic environment with men and in a certain cultural context. And here in the United States, I mean, if you look at who's attending here today, very few ordained people. Most everybody's a lay person, and there's the same number of men and women practicing, and there's many women teachers in our lineage and other Zen lineages. So naturally, you know, the forms of the practice have to change, although the yoke, as Bernie said, has to be transmitted, unadulterated. So I know many practitioners who know how to dwell in emptiness and avoid all the difficulties and painful relationships in their life. In a crude way, these practitioners are like skilled athletes who perform marvelously on the court, but then when they leave the court, their lives are kind of a mess. So most people struggle to hold onto unconscious fantasies and old, outdated formulas of behavior, even though they fail to match either reality or provide much useful direction. So we can shift. We can have an inner shift if we really descend into our unconscious mind and approach life in a new way. And our problems may not immediately disappear, but they become workable because we see them in a new light. We can use difficulties in life as opportunities for awakening and bringing light, bringing forth our finest human qualities such as awareness, compassion, humor, wisdom, and fearlessness. The problem is that we cling to unspoken truths that we don't question because we're not aware of their existence. So I always encourage you to question everything. So as children, we develop certain strategies for behavior in order to feel secure in a seemingly hostile environment. And as adults, we still carry those behavior patterns. They don't serve us well, but we keep replaying them. So in our practice, we have to enter the realm of the unknown and honor the mind of not knowing. We can discover new possibilities. So we need the courage to be willing to feel the heart, even in situations that are difficult or painful. Compassion means not to attack ourselves for going off course. Otherwise, we'll never learn from our mistakes. In order to learn from problems, we need to cultivate an acceptance of ourselves. It does not mean that we always like what's happening, but we can learn from it. So we need courage too. And courage and compassion are contained within awareness. Courage is a side of awareness that faces life directly. And compassion is a side that makes space for what is there. There's a line in the verse of case 75 of the Book of Equanimity that says, "A praiseworthy person of the way has no sharp edges." We talk about life here in residence at the Abbey. And they say that all of us have sharp edges, and living together, as long as we have awareness, we still bump into each other, and our sharp edges, like poke one another. But as we bump against each other, we start to grind off the sharp edges, and like the rocks in the bottom of a river become smooth. So that's part of living together. But we both need awareness, both the sticker of sharp edges and the one being stuck by sharp edges. So I saw a cartoon once that showed a caveman crafting the first wheel. And he had a cart, and the wheels were square rather than circular. And the caption said, "Damn, it still doesn't work." Any sharp edges, and it won't move freely. It's the same with us. Any sharp edges, and we don't move freely. Sharp edges don't necessarily mean to be aggressive. Being passive also has sharp edges. As long as we're protecting an image of how things should be or how we want things to be, the sharp edges will keep snagging on situations in our life. An ancient ancestor wrote this poem. "How many times have I changed my firmly determined mind? Mind, mind, how unreliable." So what can we rely on? There's also a Zen expression that says there's no firm piece of ground upon which to stand. So how to really be free? Well, that's what our practice teaches us. So I'll touch some of these points in the Dharma words that Roshi and I gave yesterday. She's not here, but we did it together, and this is, and Mui played the Makugyo with a rap rhythm, and we did a rap on this, but I'm going to read it to you, but just so you hear the words, and our love for Maizumi Roshi and what he gave to us. So it starts, "Dear Taizan Maezumi Roshi, And I'll do it a little rhythmically, but not quite as unfettered as we were yesterday. Okay. This is the 26th year since you left this sphere, and your career as a Zen pioneer, some would say as a racketeer or a puppeteer, pulling the strings that gave us wings, to spread your dharma seed and succeed with all speed to meet the endless need. Indeed, indeed. In the 50s, you came to LA to Zen Shuji as a Zen sensei. You knew gaijin were okay to penetrate the Buddha way. Who knows what a gaijin is? About half of you. Gaijin is a Japanese word. It means foreigner. And I don't know if you know, but in the Japanese culture, and I don't want to generalize too much, they tend to be chauvinistic. And there was a belief among a large number of Japanese priests that Westerners could not penetrate the Buddha way. They just did not have what it took. In other words, we weren't Japanese. Okay? So a gaijin means a foreigner, anybody who's not Japanese. And Maezumi Roshi didn't believe that. That's one of the reasons why he immigrated to the United States. So that's this line. You knew gaijin were okay to penetrate the Buddha way. And then Shinko said, we gaijin can penetrate the Buddha way. We came from near and far away. Some did stay and some did stray. But we did nothing halfway, including sake and Japanese buffet. Poco a poco, you would say, and we would respond, ole, ole. Every day is a good day. Not risque, not blasé. We would pray for no delay to manifest the Buddha way. Leaves of the white plum tree have multiplied abundantly, more than even you could foresee. This is your legacy. And Shinko said, we are your legacy. Many rascals who are free to adapt your teachings to our native land. But please don't misunderstand. Since you did disappear, we've shed many a tear, but we will persevere. And to be perfectly clear, we will always revere and cheer your sincere phrase, appreciate your life. That was one of his main teachings, appreciate your life. He wrote a book of his collected talks is called Appreciate Your Life. And he said, I can't tell you how many times I heard him say that. So he would say that one of the problems, with his students was they did not appreciate themselves, appreciate their lives. So to your own life be true. At first we had no clue how to make do. It was all so new. But after years of moo, we grokked your view. Thank you, thank you. See you anew. For now, adieu, adieu. So, Maizumi Roshi was a complex person in some ways, but a simple person in other ways. He was just single-minded about his mission and his vows on this earth. And I spent 23 years in close contact with him. When I lived at the Zen Center for 8 years, I saw him almost every day. I've traveled with him he asked me to help set up a Zen Center in Mexico City, which is still ongoing. I used to go to Mexico for many years, for part of the year. And he has established quite a legacy. And there's been many times when I wish he were still alive, when I have subtle questions of the Dharma and how to deal with some of you rascals. So I'll miss him every day, and I just thank you for listening, and I just wanted to share some of my experiences with him and our insights. So